Hello, my name is Mark Brown, the Executive Officer for the Marin Wildfire Prevention Authority, and thank you for attending Public Workshop number 2 for the Greater Ross Valley Shaded Fuel Break. Tonight, we'll go over through some introductions and describe the purpose of our meeting. We will discuss an overview of the Greater Ross Valley Shaded Fuel Break, what it is, and almost as importantly, what it isn't. We'll discuss the year 1 implementation plan. We will go through the efforts that we have gone through for mitigation of environmental issues and compliance and reporting that we've gone through. And then we'll have a question and answer period at the end of the meeting. For those at the meeting with us, we have 3x5 cards for you to fill out that we'll collect and coalesce. And then for those online, we have a Q&A feature. If you click on the Q&A, you can enter your question, and at the end, we'll bring those together and answer them as groups. So just some quick introductions. Again, my name is Mark Brown with the Marin Wildfire Prevention Authority. Presenting with me tonight will be Battalion Chief Todd Lando from the Central Marin Fire Department, who really is the author of this plan, and we've been working side by side with Todd and so many other people, but Todd was really the one that created this concept, and he'll be presenting again tonight. And we also have Emily Capello from Panorama, our environmental consulting firm. Also with us from Panorama is Tanya Trace, the principal for Panorama, and Caitlin Gillerin, who's just been doing a ton of work for us. And with the Marin Wildfire Prevention Authority, we have our planning and program manager, Ann Krelock. It's really important to recognize all of the partners that we have in this project: Kentfield Fire District, Ross Valley Fire, and Marin County Fire. And I'd like to point out that Ross Valley Fire is a combination of the towns of Fairfax, San Anselmo, Ross, and the Sleepy Hollow Fire Protection District. I would also like to recognize the 4 board members that we have attending tonight's meeting. Director Tom Finn from the Sleepy Hollow Fire Protection District, Supervisor Dennis Rodoni, council member from the town of Ross, Julie McMillan, and council member from the town of Fairfax, Barbara Kohler. Thank you for being here tonight. So the purpose of the meeting is so we can share the details of the Greater Ross Valley Shaded Fuel Break and our year 1 opportunity. And we like to year 1 implementation. We also like to provide an opportunity for the community to engage with us and give us feedback. And this also gives us an opportunity to provide some information on fuels and fire risk in Marin County, and to chat a little bit about the MWPA's overall programs and describe the Greater Ross Valley Shaded Fuel Break planning process. I think we're all well aware of the fires that have been going on around the state, near Marin, in Marin. But when it comes to wildfire, the best way to predict the future is to look at the past. And if you look at 1964 with the Hanley fire and compare that to 2017, the Tubbs fire, almost identical footprints. But the difference is in 1964, the Hanley fire took 2.5 days to burn the same footprint that the Tubbs fire burned in 6 hours. And if you look at this fire history of map and you see this largest fire here, this was the 1923 fire that burned from Ignacio all the way to Bolinas. And what is little known is that that same night that fire burned, the first Hanley fire burned in 1923. So the Hanley fires actually burned 3 times, 23, 64, and 2017. And Chief Jason Weber put it so well: the only difference between Marin and Sonoma on the night in 2017 is that we were lucky that we did not have an ignition in Marin. That's the only difference. So we were able to meet with the public safety agencies, law enforcement, fire, land management agencies. We asked them, what did they do before the 17 siege, during, and after? What were their successes and what were their challenges? And we were able to create a 6-page action list. But what we found was that there's no single agency to make sure that all of these action items were completed. And none of the agencies had the funding to complete those tasks. And then we had the support of the 2019 Marin Civil Grand Jury, and we have the 4-person from that Civil Grand Jury here at the meeting tonight, Pat Randolph, and they wrote a report that really echoed the information that we provided And they recommended a joint powers authority with an ongoing tax funding so that we can get the work done. So when we look at the MWPA mission, I really think that the Greater Ross Valley Shaded Fuel Break is a great example of how we are meeting these goals on this slide here. We're working side by side with our managers, our land managers. Right now, during this meeting, we have our Marin residents, and we're working with you all for this project. We have our civic leaders, whether they're elected, appointed, or, there are a lot of civic leaders who are just members of the community who have stepped up and provided leadership for their community. This is an excellent example of all of our first responders working with the MWPA to get this work done, get this work planned and implemented. And then, of course, we have many business owners and developers that are working side by side with us through this project. And, we really like to follow what we call a systems approach. And someone that's in the audience, Michael Wara, shared this analogy with me, and I like to share it. It's like our systems approach for wildfire prevention is much like the safety systems that are built in cars. We have seatbelts, we have airbags, and we have traffic avoidance systems. Just because we have airbags and traffic avoidance systems doesn't mean that we stop wearing our seatbelts. We use all of those systems. Now, when we use all of those systems, does that mean that we are not going to get into a car accident? No. Does it mean that we aren't going to be injured or potentially killed? No, unfortunately. But what it does do is it greatly decreases the chance of being hurt, injured, or killed in that car accident. And that's what the systems approach does for us. We need to use all our tools to make sure that if we do have a large wildland fire, that we can minimize the impacts. And it starts with, right here in the center, reducing the risks to our homes, working with our communities to harden their homes, create fire smart landscaping around their homes, so that when embers land in and around their homes are less likely to ignite. Then we are also improving our evacuation routes, our evacuation systems, our notification systems, so that if there is a large wildland fire, that we can get the notification out to our residents to be able to evacuate, and that when they do evacuate, their evacuation routes will be safe, because the fact is there will be traffic jams during a wildfire evacuation. These roads just simply are not designed to carry that many cars at once. So our goal is that we've improved the evacuation route safety so that even under fire conditions, people will survive when they're inside their cars. And then we are reducing the wildfire fuels, especially right up against the wildland urban interface boundary. And that's exactly what we are doing with the Greater Ross Valley Shaded Fuel Break. We're decreasing the fuels so as it approaches the communities, fire intensities go down, rates of spread go down, and it gives our residents more time to evacuate under a safer environment. It gives our firefighters a better chance to get in there and suppress the fire. We're also educating the public through our great partnership with Fire Safe Marin. And we also provide grants to our residents for home hardening, defensible space, and we also provide low-income senior homeowner tax exemption.
I think we're up to you, Todd. Yep, thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody. So I'm Todd Lando, Central Marin Fire Department. I appreciate Mark saying that this was somehow my brainchild, but it really wasn't. The concept here came from really an in-depth analysis of what's happened in the last decade in all of the fires that we now know by name in California, and looking at an overall approach that we might be able to take and implement with this funding from MWPA and Marin to reduce the chance that happens here. So this fuel break that we're going to talk about tonight, that's a loaded term. I'm going to explain what that means. This fuel break is really part of a multi-pronged strategy. It's really important to understand that this is not the only thing we're doing in Marin. In fact, this is pretty far down the list. We've been working for 2 years aggressively to reduce the likelihood that structures ignite in the county by assessing individual homes through defensible space evaluations and home hardening evaluations, educating the community on how to reduce the chances that their house will ignite from embers. We've worked on individual local fuel reduction projects in hotspots where there were significant issues that the fire service has been aware of for years, but just never had the funding to tackle. And then as we've tackled those projects, we've completed many of them over the last 2 years. We're transitioning into sort of the next phase of things, and that's where this fuel break comes in. The term shaded fuel break is critical for everybody to understand. The fuel break itself, I called it a loaded term, and it is, because when we fight fires, when we are out with the airplanes and bulldozers and hand crews fighting fires, we create something called a fuel break. Very different than what we're proposing here. A fuel break created by bulldozers tears all the vegetation out of the ground, gets us down to bare mineral soil. It's extremely aggressive and frankly harmful for the environment, but oftentimes it's the only way we can stop a fire from spreading. And oftentimes it doesn't work at all. That's not what we're proposing, and the fact that those two terms overlap, the fuel break that we're talking about is a dramatically different approach with an extremely light touch on the land. In many cases, you're not even going to know that we were here when we're finished with the work we're going to do. So a shaded fuel break, something dramatically different. The shade plays a big role in it, and I'm going to explain kind of why that is and why this is so different than the fuel break that some people may imagine we're going to create. As early as today, we've received comments from the public that are very concerned that we're talking about the type of aggressive fuel break that you might have seen in the media. So we're very important that we point out that when and emphasize this terminology, reduced fuel and forest health restoration zone. We're not just saying that because it sounds good. We really do have a problem with forest health in Marin. You guys have seen now 20 years of sudden oak death impacting the native oak trees here. You've seen the decline of the Monterey pines, which are native to California, not native to most of the places they exist in Marin. A tremendous decline in those tree species that are common out here. They're contributing to the wildfire problem right now by giving us big jackpots of flammable fuel that can make it much more difficult for us to fight fires. They're spread out all over the county. They're in people's backyards, and it's something we need to deal with. And it's all part of really the results of climate change, human development, encroachment, introduced species, this long-term drought have all contributed to really unhealthy conditions in most of Marin's forests and woodlands. So again, I'm going to talk more about the shaded fuel break here after giving you a little intro to the objective of this project. I just introduced you to this idea that we need to step into the next phase of work in Marin, and it really brings us to the concept of looking at Marin strategically, looking and understanding where the fires have burned in the past, like Chief Brown pointed out, thinking about what has happened in these big fires. Mark talked about the Tubbs fire, the Thomas fire in Southern California, the Camp Fire, famously, all of these fires happened in an 18-month period, coincidentally. The Camp Fire in Paradise, California, all of these fires did something really similar. They all, not only did they burn under similar weather conditions where we had these strong dry winds coming from the east or the northeast, but they all transitioned at some point from a wildfire that started in undeveloped wild areas and transitioned into the built environment in our communities, the wildland-urban interface, the way we describe it often. Those fires made that transition by impacting the edge of a community and igniting a number of homes. And in each case, when we really look at sort of these fires as a case study for how we might fight these fires in the future, like those of us in the fire service recognize that one of the big failure points was the fact that a number of homes ignited simultaneously very early on in these fires at the edge of the community and overwhelmed the few resources that can get there to fight a fire early on in a fire. We recognize that some of these fires might not have turned out the way they had if we had been able to prevent those initial homes. We're talking sometimes 3, 6, maybe a dozen homes at most from igniting early on. We're taking this multi-pronged approach to reducing the chances that those homes ignite. We need homeowners to maintain defensible space. We need them to harden their homes, and we need to reduce the intensity of the fire right at the edge of the community where a fire is going to transition into the built environment. And we know where that transition is going to occur because we know exactly where the homes are in Marin, and we know where the historical footprints of fires are. We know where the wind conditions are going to drive the next fire. We're confident of this, and we should be, because this history keeps repeating itself. So we did use computer modeling to help design parts of this and to understand how we might approach the vegetation treatments that need to occur, even to understand where future fires might occur, you know, within sort of the scope of what we understand from history. But the reality is a lot of this comes from our historical knowledge, our intuition, and our understanding of what fires look like today in California. Primary objective was to comply with and complete a CEQA analysis. That's the California Environmental Quality Act. Any work that we do in the environment, you know, as government agencies, needs to comply with this. It's a comprehensive review where you're going to hear a lot more about that. But it was critical that we complete the CEQA analysis, and that we you know, design this project and implement it in the least harmful way possible to the environment. The location of this project is really important in that it's, you know, Central Marin. I wear the Central Marin Fire Department patch, but the Ross Valley really divides Marin in some ways, sort of east to west and north to south. It separates Novato and San Rafael from Southern Marin and the Mount Tamalpais watershed. And it's a place where these historic fires had to travel through. This valley, in fact, the location where we're standing right now was one of the places where they fought the fire in 1923, the Sleepy Hollow Ranch. They bussed in students from San Rafael High School to fight the fire then, because they could, because the fuel conditions in 1923 were such that kids on a school bus could fight that fire. That's not the case today. So this fuel break wrapping the entire valley winds up being 38 miles long. Crosses private lands and public lands, all of those agencies and the types of landowners that Mark mentioned earlier. You know, big players, they're big properties. One of the biggest properties we'll work on is right here, the San Domenico School and Triple C Ranch. And then a lot of, in fact, about 1,600 individual private parcels with just single residences on them, all are right at the edge of this community. So we've modeled that, we've mapped it, and we know who and where we're going to approach to get this work done. This is sort of the meat of things that I think is so important. We're discussing what's generally a 200-foot wide shaded fuel break at the edge of the community. That shaded fuel break incorporates the defensible space zone around houses, which is required by law, has been since the 1960s. 100 feet of maintenance is required around every structure by the person who owns that property. So this fuel break, that 200 feet, includes 100 feet that's already and always has been required by law. We're going to be reducing fuel in that zone and reducing the vegetation, reducing especially harmful non-native hazardous vegetation, dead vegetation that's on the ground, to reduce the intensity of a fire in that 200-foot wide swath. That 200-foot wide swath covers about 1,379 acres of land. That doesn't mean that we're going to touch, or we're going to treat, or that we're going to have chainsaws or any kind of equipment on 1,300 acres of land. That just means that's the actual air surface area of that 200-foot wide swath through the Ross Valley. There are a lot of places, and I want to emphasize this, where we have existing grasslands, healthy native oak grasslands, right behind houses for 200 feet out. That's what we want to mimic. We want to restore those types of conditions, but where they already exist, it's done. There's nothing for us to be done. Unfortunately, there's not enough of that. We see invasive French broom and all of these other issues out there. But there are a lot of places where we simply don't have to work, because for a variety of reasons, the land is already sort of meets that standard of a healthy, a healthy native grassland. We've about 1,150 acres when we actually look at where we might touch the ground. We did the environmental analysis that you're going to hear about. It did look at up to 300 feet from structures, and that was to help give us a little additional cushion where we could safely work if we felt we needed to. It also takes into account that some of the maps of building locations are not entirely accurate, so we wanted to make sure we looked at every inch of ground that we could potentially work on, just to make sure that the environmental analysis and the identification of any potential effects of this project were going to be analyzed properly. And we also looked at about 500 acres of additional land sort of outside of the scope of the fuel break itself, but where we felt that there might be logical reason for work to occur in the future. We don't intend to do it as part of this project, but we wanted to make sure the environmental analysis was in place so that we could look at those places in the future if we find significant hazards. But so the treatment, right? We use the word treatment and throw it around, but I realize not everybody thinks in those terms. Those are the things that we do on the ground. That's what, when we have a landscape contractor or a tree service out doing the work for us, or the Tamalpais fire crew from Marin County Fire Department with all of their hand tools, that's the work they're doing. Chainsaws, hand tools, even just picking up the dead wood on the ground and carrying it. That's part of the treatment. We're treating the land in the sense that we're trying to remove the hazardous vegetation, the accumulation of dead vegetation, remove the hazardous invasive plants that have begun to take over a lot of Marin. That's our treatment. Most of the work, the vast majority of the work we do is going to be done by hand. It's going to be, workers, these crews out walking on the hillside, in some cases behind homes, in all cases, right behind homes, picking up dead vegetation on the ground and manually pulling French broom, Scotch broom, those invasive plants. It's not going to be an aggressive treatment. You're in very few cases are you ever going to see any kind of heavier machinery or tractors or anything like that. Those might be used in places where we need to pick up a heavy log or very, very limited scenarios. But most of this is going to be done by people and by hand. It's going to be relatively quiet, very low impact. We are looking at the potential to, in certain places, use, we call it prescribed herbivory here, but those are the goats that you see out in the hills. They're working in Sleepy Hollow right now. We have almost 1,600 goats working in Marin. When I say we, I mean we as residents of Marin. Those goats are not working for the Marin Wildfire Prevention Authority. They're working for the Open Space District and private landowners right now. But there are places where the goats might be a good tool for us to help control those plants like French broom. And when we identify places where the goats might be the best, safest, lowest impact tool to use, we plan on using them. Right now, there's a lot of other work that needs to happen before we choose the exact location where goats may or may not be used. But they're a popular tool. They're very light on the land. They're a great way for us to treat some of the vegetation out there. And some areas we're simply not going to work for a variety of reasons. There may be, sensitive species that you're going to hear about in a minute. There may be places where the ground is too steep for us to safely work without triggering erosion. So there are places that are sort of excluded from this project for a variety of reasons, even some places where we're concerned about the wildfire hazard, but we're just, for a variety of reasons, we're not going to be able to work there. And we're going to have to look at those areas and find other ways to reduce the wildfire risk in places where we can't work. Next slide goes to Emily from Panorama.
Hi, I'm Emily from Panorama, and we helped do the CEQA compliance document. So after deciding what the project was, the first thing that we needed to do was see how are we going to best and most efficiently meet CEQA. And it was determined through conversations with MWPA and Central Marin Fire that a project-specific analysis under the CAL FIRE vegetation treatment plan was the best way to go about doing CEQA. We don't want to go into too much detail about that just because we really want to get to the implementation part, but we do have a poster board for anybody who's interested in the room that kind of talks through what is CAL FIRE's VTP process, what is a project-specific analysis, how you go about all the different steps that you have to do to be able to meet that. And we have that online, MWPA does, so that anybody who's interested in the overall CEQA process can understand it. We had an outreach meeting to the public in March that kind of talked through really how are we getting through CEQA. But we did look at a project-specific analysis. We also included an addendum because there were certain areas that were outside of the treatable landscape under the CAL FIRE VTP. And then once that was complete, once we'd done all the appropriate studies for that, we moved on to presenting it to MWPA's board as well as Open Space. They both reviewed it, and after reviewing it and discussing it, MWPA board approved it June 16th, 2022, and then Open Space approved the PSA July 12th, 2022. As part of that process, we looked at all of the required mitigation measures and also all of the standard project requirements. These are terms and measures that came directly from the programmatic EIR that CAL FIRE did. So we looked at each and every one of those and saw which one was appropriate for the circumstances for this project. So you really have to look at your own project and then determine what is most appropriate. We made a list of all of those. Those are part of implementing this project. But then in addition to everything that's required for the CAL FIRE process, MWPA has its own project design and implementation features. There's a lot of acronyms for all the different measures. So I like to read them just to be sure. And we looked at each one of those and made sure that they are also being used for this project where it's appropriate. And that's true for all MWPA projects. They look at their own PDIFs and they decide which ones need to be implemented prior to doing any of the work on the ground. So all of this has taken not quite a year, but it's been a long time to get through the CEQA documentation and also to make sure that we have the right mitigation measures. As part of that process, I did want to take a moment to talk through the resource review that we've done to date. Part of that was for the PSA, but then there's also additional review that's required after the PSA is done in order to actually get to the implementation process. So for example, for biological resources, as part of the PSA, you have to do a desktop review. And then we also sent folks into the field to look at whether or not all the data that we had and that we had looked at was appropriate, or the conditions changed. Was there anything that we were missing? That was all done in order to make sure the PSA was appropriate and CEQA compliant. After that, you still need to go out and do protocol level botanical surveys. So we've had folks out into the field 3 times to make sure that they're completing all of the botanical surveys. And what we found was that there weren't any species that we needed to be too concerned at, except around Ring Mountain, and that's where our image comes from. We went out and did those surveys in areas that we thought we might do work this year, but we're actually not going to do any of the work in Ring Mountain. But we did do still the protocol level surveys for this year. We documented that. That's information that MWPA now has and can use in implementation in other years if it goes into that area. We also did a vegetation community desktop review, so more biological review prior to the PSA and post. For cultural resources, you have to do what's called a record search. You ask for any information about any cultural resources that are known within the area that you're interested in, and that's your area and a buffer. We did outreach to Native American tribes, as is required under the Cal VTP EIR. And then we also did modeling to see where might there be sensitive resources below ground in case there was any ground disturbance that could impact cultural resources, but also surface level, so that if you go out and you're on the field, you know which areas would require additional cultural surveys or might require monitoring. So all of this went into both the PSA and then some work that we've been doing post, and that's going to be moved into implementation. Finally, we also did a lot of slope and soil review because the Cal VTP EIR has very specific requirements of what it allows above a certain slope and what it does not. It's really trying to avoid erosion. It's trying to avoid having heavy machinery go out if the slope is too steep. So we needed to make sure that we had a very good understanding of what is on the ground.
So the project is going to take several years for us to complete and millions of dollars, frankly, some of it from our local tax dollars from tax measure C and some of it from a $3.5 million grant from CAL FIRE that we were able to secure this year. So when we recognize that it's going to take us several years, we anticipate probably 3 years at a minimum to make the first pass through all of this ground on 38 miles. We broke it down into what is the work that we can accomplish in year 1. There were several factors that played a role in how we selected the ground that we're going to treat, using that term again, this year, meaning the fiscal year 22-23, from July to July of next year. And the decisions on where we were going to treat were based on some of the wildfire modeling and the analysis that Panorama's team gave us, which was fantastic, helped us understand where hotspots might be, where the greatest fire intensity might be using computer modeling. We took that and we looked at our understanding, again, kind of the intuition, the knowledge of the firefighters who fought fire now for decades in many cases, like Chief Brown and I in Marin County. We looked at the fire history, where those fires had spread, especially that 1923 fire. And then we also recognized that this year the funding was going to be a little bit lower. The CAL FIRE funds won't be available until late this year, maybe early 23. So we still have a lot of other work to do, like the defensible space and home hardening work and the local projects that MWPA is undertaking. So we felt we were able to commit about $1 million from local tax dollars this year to this project. And we needed to treat as much ground as possible in the first year, critical ground in the first year as we could with that $1 million. This corridor, the reason we're holding this meeting in Sleepy Hollow in the clubhouse is because this is one of those key locations that we identified. First and foremost, this is that area, like I described, where that 1923 fire first reached the Ross Valley when it started in Novato. I'm counting on you, Mike, to try to keep that from happening again. But should it happen, and should it cross the Lucas Valley and into the Ross Valley, it's most likely going to come through the same gap in the hillside where it did in 1923, which is just about half a mile from where we're sitting behind San Domenico School. We know that, and we know that that's an important place, and those are the first houses that are likely to be impacted by that fire under those same conditions. So this community is a critical location. This is the type of community where we want to stop those first half dozen or so houses, like I described, from igniting. We selected this segment, which really runs from where the Red Hill Shopping Center is, Red Hill and San Anselmo, all the way up through the Sorich Park, which is San Anselmo, town of San Anselmo owned open space, up through the Terra Linda Sleepy Hollow Divide open space preserve, through San Domenico School, all private property, Rocking H Ranch, parts of Skywalker Ranch, and then Marin County open space up on the Loma Alta open space preserve, all the way through to Fairfax, to essentially to White's Hill, near the summit of White's Hill. It's a big stretch of land, and there are several reasons in addition to simply the fire risk that we chose to tackle this. One, it requires a really light touch on the land. The work that we need to do here is much less intensive than some of the work we may have to do in subsequent years on the east side or the west side of the valley on the slopes of Mount Tam. This is mostly grass and oak woodlands. It's seen many years of grazing because a lot of this was ranch land, even as recently as a decade or two ago. The open space district has done a really good job with the goat grazing and maintenance on a lot of this property already. The amount of work that needs to be done here was reasonable, that we might be able to complete this entire section with that budget that we have this year. We're going to move quickly through here, and we have a short window to get this work done for a variety of reasons. We're starting work next week, August 1st. You will be some of the first work that happens on the ground on this section of the project in the year one implementation plan. And we want to get this as much work done as possible by February 1st, because that's when we recognize that some of the bird nesting begins, and we want to have as little disturbance as possible on nesting birds. So we think that in that 4-month window, we can get just about all of this work completed. It's going to be a lot of work, a lot of crews on the ground. It's all going to be based on that prioritization that I just described. In year one, the methods are going to be just like I described earlier. They're going to be hand crews working from the ground, people on the ground with hand tools, sometimes power tools. We're transitioning to use battery-powered tools as much as possible because they're quieter, they're lighter, they're easier for the crews to work. They work just as well as gas-powered tools. There will be some gas-powered tools out there, but we're encouraging our crews to make a transition to electric tools. Not to mention, air quality and the reduced carbon footprint from battery-powered tools. So you're going to see people just like this working from the ground using pole saws, hand saws, picking up vegetation on the ground. The work that they're doing here is not removing live trees. We have no intention of removing any live native trees out there. The goal is to reduce the likelihood that a fire climbs into the canopy of those trees that we depend on for the shade. That shade in the shaded fuel break is so critical. We're going to be removing lower limbs on trees. Those are mostly lower limbs that wouldn't be there if we hadn't interfered in the environment, right? We've eliminated the native grazing animals like elk that used to graze 6-8 feet off of the ground. We've eliminated wildfires that used to burn the lower limbs off of trees in very low intensity wildfires. So we have oak trees where their limbs grow into the ground now, and that doesn't happen in California historically in the native environment that isn't interfered with by man. So we're going to try to mimic some of those conditions, remove the dead vegetation that's fallen out of trees on the ground, remove the French broom and the invasive plants that are built up on the forest floor, limb up those trees to mimic what should have happened to them in nature. In some cases, you'll see, like I mentioned, the goat grazing used to help reduce, they're a very effective tool to help reduce the regrowth of French broom in the appropriate location. And you're going to see folks working in and around some of the brushland. The goal is not to remove all of the brush. The goal is to reduce the flammability of the brush and shrubs that are there, native shrubs especially. So coyote brush, things like that, for the most part, they're going to stay. We're going to remove some of the accumulation of dead wood on them. There will be some cases where we cut back or prune shrubs back farther away from structures, but for the most part, the goal is to create mimic what a natural environment might have looked like here by selecting for the native plants, removing the non-native, and removing the dead vegetation that's accumulated on the ground. In no way is this going to be that type of fuel break where we're looking at bare ground. You know, in some cases in Southern California chaparral, you can see miles and miles of ridgetop fuel breaks where they've stripped 200-300 feet down to bare ground in an effort to stop a fire from crossing over ridgetops. That's not what we're doing here. We've never proposed that. We've never suggested that. It's, if you read beyond the word shaded or fuel break in the title of this document, you realize that's not what we're doing. So it's really important that we get that word out in the community, that people understand that the goal here is not to reduce the land down to bare soil. It's to restore a healthy plant environment where firefighters can make a stand, protect the structures, where the homes at the edge of the community will be exposed to less intense heat, less intense fire when that fire does occur, and it's going to occur. The goal of this project is not to stop a fire. It's not that type of fuel break at all. The goal here is to reduce the intensity of a fire when it reaches the structures. So most of this work is going to be focused on that first 100 feet from structures. And I think you probably remember me saying, and you've probably gotten a knock on the door from some of our fire inspectors, a few of them are in the back of the room here, explaining what homeowners' responsibilities are. We're going to be encouraging homeowners to do what they're required to do by law to reduce the vegetation on their own property out 100 feet from their structures. But we recognize that many homeowners, you know, have deferred maintenance, let's say, on their property, that many property owners, and not just homeowners, you know, frankly, public landowners and some of the big ranches also have deferred maintenance near structures and it's reached a point where the accumulation of dead vegetation, dead trees, the growth of French broom and other exotic invasive plants, it's just gotten beyond the point of control. The homeowners, the property owners can no longer afford to do the work. It's overwhelming, and we recognize that this may be an opportunity using funds from the MWPA and from the CAL FIRE grant for us to catch up on maintenance for them, and then really hand that maintenance in some cases, most cases, back to the property owner. Once we've gotten that French broom under control, the annual maintenance is much easier for most property owners to continue with. Once we've removed the dead trees on the ground and limbed up those trees, not only have we reduced the intensity of a fire when it reaches that part of the land, but we've reduced the maintenance that's required the following year for the property owner. So I'm going to show you a couple pictures of places where we've done work that's very similar. In fact, I think most of these pictures are actually already within the footprint of the Greater Ross Valley Shaded Fuel Break. This is at the top of Christmas Tree Hill in Corte Madera. I know there's a lot of concern about us removing trees. That's not the intent. That's not what we're doing. This is an example. This is a redwood forest that frankly was in an extraordinarily unhealthy condition. This is a place that's been disturbed repeatedly over the years by wildfires, by human development. There are houses just off the edge here, by neglect. In this photograph, the only things that were removed were dead limbs within 20 feet of the ground on young redwood trees and hundreds of dead redwood trees that were somewhere between 2 and 4 inches in diameter. These were redwood trees that were overcrowded. They were unable to compete, and they died and were standing dead in place. Really, a big accumulation of kindling that would have killed even the handful of mature redwood trees that are there, and really impacted the health of this forest. And not to mention creating better habitat for hunting for spotted owls and for other animals that depend on this ground for habitat. What we did here was really restore a much healthier condition, very light touch on the land, and we removed no living trees at all in this photograph. That's so important for us to emphasize. This is what you ought to expect in many places where we do this kind of work. And frankly, there's very little redwood forest that we're going to touch. Just there isn't that much in existence anymore within 200 feet of homes in the Ross Valley. This is one of the few places where you actually see this. I think I already talked about this concept, but we are going to work with private property owners. We are going to do some work on private property, especially in places where we are able to identify that homeowners simply are not going to be able to afford the type of work that's required to bring that health back to their property. But we're also going to and are actively enforcing the fire code requirements. We're out educating homeowners on what their responsibility is, and you will see our fire inspectors inspecting and re-inspecting, following up on properties at the edge of the Ross Valley that are adjacent to this fuel break to not just encourage, but in some cases give a gentle nudge to homeowners to make sure that they take care of their responsibility. There will be opportunities. There will be knocks on the doors from some of the folks like Mike St. John, and Brian McCarthy, who's here. They're going to be helping us implement this project. Talking to homeowners, explaining what's available to them, explaining part of their responsibility, and working with people to gain access to the property and ensure that the work is done on private lands. Back to Emily.
So this is really the slide where we want to kind of focus on. So this is really the slide where we want to focus on how did we, now that we're in implementation, how do we take all that information that we have and make sure that the folks who are actually implementing it have all this information so they can take it into consideration when they're doing the work. The work needs to happen in accordance with all of the measures that I talked about before. And that means that we need to know a lot about where are these resources located. Folks who are on the ground have appropriate maps so they can see what's happening. And so they can download this information and can actually have it geo-referenced to where they're working. You don't see it here, but the botanical survey, special set of species from our surveys, those will all be on maps. It's not information that we can share publicly, but all that information will be available. We have highlighted where are there important wildlife species. We're avoiding nesting bird season, as Todd mentioned. If the work continues into nesting season, that's allowed. That's allowed under the PSA, but then you have to do nesting bird surveys. That's required before you can work in that season. Then you have to make sure that any of the work is not within a buffer around those nesting birds. So that's one of those elements that if we keep moving past February 1st, you would need to do additional work at that time. We have maps, not this one again, because cultural resources can't be shared widely, but we have maps that show areas where there are known cultural resources that people need to avoid. We also have maps that show where it's more likely that you would have cultural resources. And so those maps will be used to determine whether or not we need to do surveys based on the type of work that's happening. If there's no ground disturbance, or if it's a very light touch, we'll do a lot of training and then determine whether or not you need additional surveys. If you're doing ground disturbance and it's an area that's really sensitive, then you would likely require cultural surveys as well. The maps also show slope because there's erosion potential tied to slope, and people need to, the folks who are doing the work need to be able to know what can they do above a certain slope and what can't they. We have soil types mapped here as well. You can see the serpentine rock, which is the purple there. That's mapped because that soil type has the potential to have naturally occurring arsenic. We want everyone who's doing that to be sure that they're aware of that so they don't get dust into the air that could potentially be harmful to anybody. We have the blue lines, which you can see, those are streams. They have their own protection. People are also being trained on rain events. It can also include or increase the erosion and then any fire risk. So these types of maps are happening for every inch where the work is happening this first year of implementation, and will continue as we move forward through any of the other years of implementation. We're also doing a lot of training and oversight, and we've already started doing some of the training with the folks who are managing the implementation. So Mike, as we just said, we've already started training with him because we need to make sure that they're aware of all of the resources and all of the requirements that they need to do to make sure that they are compliant with the PSA that that was finished. We'll also have specialized training for the crew leaders and then trainings as well for all of the crew. So we're going to go through all of those mitigation measures, all of the project requirements, all of the MWPA requirements, and make sure that they're very understandable. If anybody has questions, they know they can reach out to us. Panorama is a big part of this as well. And then we'll make sure that anybody who has been trained, that is noted, that they have to write down their name, that it was that they are received the training, and then that they're abiding by those requirements as they do the work. Trainings are provided in both English and Spanish. We recognize that a lot of the folks who will be doing the work, Spanish might be a more comfortable language, so we're providing those trainings in 2 languages. And then finally, I just wanted to talk about some of the mitigation compliance and reporting, which is another requirement under CEQA, is that after you do the work, after you've done the training, you basically report it out to the agency who reviewed the CEQA document. In this case, it will go both to CAL FIRE because of the CAL VTP, and it would also go to MWPA. So annually, there'll be a report that looks at all the measures that are required, looks at all the work that was done, and make sure that they were implemented appropriately. It's also a way of making sure that as you go through and do your mitigation, you learn stuff, and anything that was learned can then be passed on to the next year. So when you're implementing it in year 2, you take all the information that you learned and you're able to apply it and make your projects even more robust when it comes to CEQA and any of the environmental protections. MWPA will also be compiling reports annually, and it will also be mapping all the areas where treatment happened so that that can also be available, and both CAL FIRE and then anybody in Marin will be able to see where this work happened. And that brings us to the end of the presentation part. I think we have about half an hour maybe, or today, if not a little bit more.
Yeah, and so first of all, Ann Prelock is going to walk around and collect any of the Q&A cards that you may have had. So if you could just hold it up, she will come by and get it from you. We see that we have one question online already. If for those of you that are online, if you want to throw out some more questions, go for it. I did want to just do a quick summarization of some of the concepts of what this is and what this is not, and also give a description of how this has been proven to work already. I like to use the Caldor fire as an example. The Tahoe Basin is an area that has learned from fire, and the name of the fire is escaping me back in 2008. Help me. Angora fire. Thank you. They learned quite a bit from the Angora fire, and the residents became very involved, and shaded fuel breaks along the wildland urban interface boundary were created. So as the Caldor fire approached the Tahoe Basin, and the Caldor fire did something that only one other fire did in history, and it happened to be the Dixie fire, and it happened in the same year, and that is a fire crossing the crest of the Sierras. That had never happened before. It happened twice last year. When the fire approached the Tahoe Basin, the quote from the incident commander of that fire was, "We went from 150-foot flame lengths to 15-foot flame lengths." And we've already done some of the preliminary analysis of the flame lengths that we would expect in untreated areas versus treated areas, and we are seeing a similar percentage range of that decrease in the flame lengths, fire line, and intensities, rates of spread. So this is a proven concept that works. Do we expect it to, and this has been emphasized, but I think it's worth emphasizing again, do we expect it to stop the fires? No, it changes the fire intensity. It provides us an opportunity to fight the fire. almost as importantly though, as a major fire is approaching it and all the embers are showering down, there's less fuel for those embers to start new intense spot fires that create new embers close to our homes. And those are the embers that pound up against our homes and destroy our homes. So there's multiple ways that this shaded fuel break is going to improve our safety. But we also are making sure that we're doing it environmentally safe and sound. We talk about it being up to 300 feet. Please know that for the first 100 feet, we're going to be meeting the requirements of defensible space as per the state guidelines. From 100 to 200 feet, it's going to be a lighter touch on the land. And in that last 200, 300 feet, an even lighter touch in that land. And I think you've seen in the pictures, and some of the pictures, actually, it's hard to see some of the changes that are in there. So I just want to reiterate some of those concepts. I also want to introduce some of you, some people that I neglected to introduce at the beginning. And two of them were referred to already, Mike St. John and Brian McCarthy. They will be two of our key people that are working with us to implement the project, to communicate with our residents, but also to guide the crews to make sure that the crews are doing exactly what we want them to do. And then I need to introduce the rest of my staff that we are finally starting to develop. And so Josh, Maria, Stephen, and Martina, please come out. This is the rest of the MWPA team. So you have now seen all of MWPA as far as staff members. This is Josh. Sometimes he gets lost. Maria, Stephen, and Martina, our newest member. And then I would like to also thank Mayor Hellman from Fairfax for being here. Thank you for coming. So Q&A time. And I'll kind of help facilitate that. This is a good question. Can you explain embers and how far they can travel? And you guys need to be careful when you ask me and Todd and others like us fire behavior questions. We'll talk all day long, all night long. Embers are pieces of little burning material that fly through the air. How far they can travel is relative on what is causing the ember. Grass, you're probably talking 30 plus feet that an ember from a grass fire can ignite a new fire. So not very far. But when we start talking about some of the brush, or more importantly for this project, dead piles of vegetation or layered vegetation, you can start getting much heavier embers that can get up and get blown up against the houses. And then there's a combination of convective lift, and that's the heat causing everything to rise like you have in your chimney. And then the prevailing wind pushing those embers. So if you create enough energy in a fire that can create enough lift that very heavy embers can fly up into the air and then get into that prevailing wind, that's when we start talking about spotting distance in half mile, 3/4 of a mile. I've actually seen 3 miles. Rare case, but 3/4 of a mile in a firestorm of heavy embers is about average. And then another key point though is sometimes homes are the items that create the embers that travel the furthest and cause that much more destruction. And what we found is that if we can keep the first layer of homes from becoming ignited as a fire comes into an urban area, we can stop the urban conflagration from happening. Sometimes I try to say I'm not old enough for glasses, but another great question. What is the plan for ongoing maintenance? And I saw this question online. Once we get the work done, this project, and Mike Swayze's been pounding this into my head, it is infrastructure. And like any piece of infrastructure, there has to be maintenance. Yes, we are programming ongoing maintenance into this work. The frequency of that ongoing maintenance is based on the type of fuel. Grass, where we're doing grazing and or weed eating or whatever, obviously we're going to have to maintain that almost every year. You start getting into the shrubbery, the brush, we're looking at 2 to 3, 4 years for that maintenance. When we get into start looking at the trees, we'll be talking that 3 to 5, 6 types years for that type of maintenance.
One of the nice things about the PSA is it gives you that time under CEQA to continue doing that maintenance. So it's good, not just now and not for the next few years, but it can be good for 10, even 15 years, assuming the resources don't change that much. So it's one of the really unique tools that we have with that, is that we can keep doing the maintenance and make sure the resources haven't changed, that the mitigation measures are still appropriate, that any other measures are appropriate and being carried forward, and keep using that CEQA documentation.
And then I invite, as I answer these questions, I can just rattle on forever. I invite all of you guys to come up and step in and stop me. I do want to ask this, or mention this follow-up question. How can residents assist? I love that question. Todd described it well. We are helping on residents' property, the deferred maintenance that's probably been going on. How property owners can assist is after we've helped with that deferred maintenance, you continue the maintenance as we go on. This is another real good question and something that we're working on. And I think I saw Belle Cole online. I'm sure she's asking the same question. Is it possible to get credit back for the dead wood or to reuse some of the waste that we are, green waste that we are creating and biomass? And we are looking at ways to be able to reuse the biomass that is generated from this work. In fact, the MWPA is partnering with ecologically sound practices, One Marin, Drawdown Marin, and we've received a grant for $500,000 from the state of California Office of Planning and Research to evaluate biomass and reuse of that biomass. So in the future, we look to be expanding that. So Emily, this is for you. I'll let you read it.
It says that protocol level surveys were done in some areas, but MWPA won't be doing the work in those areas yet. And so the question is, how long are protocol level botanical surveys good for under CEQA and TDFW? And it is 2 years. So we would be able to use it if they did some work in Ring Mountain where we found special status species next year. But if not, we would need to repeat the botanical surveys. 2 years, I should say, it's up to 2 years, depending on the circumstances. CEQA often says that you have to look at what's on the ground. Does it seem like it hasn't changed? In which case you could use them again. If not, you would repeat the botanical surveys. So
we don't need to do any work on Ring Mountain where the special status species.
no, that would be avoided in any case, but.
All right, is there a ratio between percentage of fire safety and the width of the fuel break? That is a question that we are actually digging into deeply. And that is, what are our measures of success in wildfire prevention? Especially if that fuel break never gets tested by an aggressive fire. So we have started a process of evaluating how we can quantify the risk reduction that we are creating. So right now that answer actually doesn't exist, and we're kind of leading the charge and answering that question for the first time. Why not make the fuel break wider? We are following fire behavior analysis and fire modeling based on the terrain and the fuels to outline the width that we are looking for. And so we are sticking with the proven science for that width. And should there be a waiver for CEQA for fire safety reasons? It depends on the scope of a project of what we are exempt from and what we are not. The size of this project, we are not, but the Cal VTP is a streamlined process for us to be able to execute our environmental compliance a little bit more efficiently. And how much will the fuel break alter the landscape, specifically visually? We think it's going to, personally, we think it's going to make it look nicer. However, it's some of the areas you're going to be challenged to identify where we actually did the work after things have started to regrow of one season. And I think I see Tanya coming up to help with our online questions. we have a question that says, how many educational community sessions will there be? I don't believe we're planning another session for this project at this time. However, correct me if I'm wrong.
No.
But we are recording it and we'll have the full session posted onto our website, including the audio that was excluded at the beginning.
I'd love to, this is Anne speaking. I'd love to add that we are hosting site visits at various places around the project. So the next one is August 17th at 9:30 a.m. Location to be determined, but we're excited to host people and show people what we're doing, what the project is and what the project isn't. We'll be posting all that information online on the project webpage.
Thank you. Another question is the maintenance of the fuel break. I think we covered that. How can we avoid having trees haphazardly trimmed, as we've seen with other people doing vegetation management? And it is part of our training, and also having people like Brian and Mike out there ensuring that our crews are doing what we want them to be doing. What does the term shaded refer to exactly? And that is an important concept. And I think we discussed it, but I want to reemphasize that, especially if we're receiving this question. The shade over the ground fuels is very important. Pre-fire and post-fire. Pre-fire, it's helping to preserve the moisture that's in the ground. It helps the vegetation that we want to be growing to grow. It gives our critters food to eat. During the fire, what it does is it decreases the temperature of the fuel and increases the moisture of the fuel. And before the fuel can ignite, all the moisture has to be driven out. And we actually have a formula that we can work out in the field called a probability of ignition. And whether or not something is shaded or unshaded drastically changes that probability of ignition. So by keeping the shade over those fuels, we decrease the probability of ignition for when an ember lands. So that's why the shade is important for us. I'm sorry, we don't have a kitchen, I'm sorry. Or not a kitchen, a camera, sorry. The other question is that we are working, heard that you are working with private homeowners. Will you also be working with private business along the way, such as San Domenico School and the Mount Tam Cemetery, the Cedars and San Anselmo, so on and so on? Absolutely, yes. For those of you online, we've met with all three of those entities in the last 24 hours. And I think our last question online, are we going to document the work, especially with photos and for changes over the years? Absolutely. Yes, we will.
So there was just one item that Todd had mentioned, but I wasn't in front of the mic, so I'm just going to repeat it for anybody online, which had to do with the special status plant species. Where they were found is not where we'd be doing any of the work this year or in subsequent years, because it's not where you would need to do fire maintenance. So that was just something to clarify, that while you would need to repeat it if the work came in the future, that's not where the work is actually happening anyway, because it's not where you would need to do any fire maintenance.
Actually, one last thing. Again, I can talk fire behavior all night long. Brian knows that very well. But I want to piggyback on what Todd had talked about, the 1923 fire that went from Ignacio into the Ross Valley through Sleepy Hollow and then kept on going. Last year, we had a fire on a red flag day, and it was a real, some red flag days aren't as strong as other red flag days. This was a strong red flag day. We had a fire that was ignited on that red flag day in the grass on a slope that was in alignment with the wind, so that the direction of the slope and the wind were the same. It burned through an area that had been responsibly grazed by the landowner. And I was watching the fire on our cameras that we have. And when it ignited, I said, I really hope that they can hold this fire on the ridge. At first look, it looked like it held on the ridge. But then when the smoke went away and the camera zoomed in, it didn't hold on the ridge. it held on a mid-slope road below the ridge. Brian, how many grass fires have you seen hold on a mid-slope road without anyone suppressing it? Not many, especially on a red flag day. Where that fire occurred is probably exactly where the 1923 fire got into Sleepy Hollow. And so this is a up close and personal example here at home, how this work works, or how these types of projects can work. So I want to thank you all for being here tonight, both online and in person. And thank you for being involved. Lots of treats over there. Please get them.